Okay, so let's render this. So coming back out here, we need to do something that we've often done in the past, which is make, oh, not a groove merge. Let's make some render nodes. So I'm going to say render building. Render building can, let's grab the high res here for our building, and we'll object merge that into this thing here, or not into smoke, into here. And there it is. Sweet. While we're here, I'm going to say, don't forget to turn on motion blur. So velocity blur on that. And I'll make this a nice, stunning red color. So render building is good. I'm going to copy and paste this one. We'll do render particles next. I believe we have a null set up for that already in our particles. Now we don't want the direct simulation output. We want like, yeah, we're going to set this up in a minute, but we're going to do something between here and here. Or we're going to actually set the color and size of our various particles. But before we do that, let's just set it up. So there it is. And make that be here. Now again, it's important that this has motion blur on, which of course we do because we just copied from the other one. This can be the actual smoke itself. And that'll point to the smoke area where we just were. Now while we're here actually, so we have all these different caches, right? I'm just going to go ahead and delete them. I mean, they're not literally deleted from the disk, of course, but there you go. Let's put a null here. That'll be the actual output of this. And I should also say that, and I think we've done this in previous lessons, but on the file cache itself, go to load from file and say, and I'll just go to a frame just as an example. Let's tell it to load as a packed disk primitive. Basically what that means is it won't really load it. It'll just load a reference to the file on disk. We can still say display as full geometry, so we can totally still see it here in the viewport. But it's kind of like our packed things from before, where now if I actually look at this, it's packaged up inside of a packed thing. The benefit here is that when I try to render this to Mantra, it will normally, if I don't have this set as a packed thing, normally in the standard all geometry mode, all these volumes that take up, hundreds of megabytes on disk or whatever, it has to actually take them from being in memory in Houdini. So it's got to load it into Houdini from here. Now it's in memory, and then it has to write it back out to disk so that Mantra, the renderer, can then read it. So it just wastes time, and we don't usually want to do that. We have to deal with the regular volumes here normally if we're going to make changes to them. But seeing as this kind of the last thing before it gets rendered, we're not going to make any more changes. That's when we can do this packed disk primitive thing. So I'm going to do two things. One is, you can see how my computer keeps hanging here. And that's because I would imagine, at least in part, is that it keeps trying to load these huge volumes into the GPU. So I would say bring these numbers probably back down now that we're not making those flipbooks anymore. 256 will still be a pretty decent resolution, but it's not going to make our GPU choke so much. So in any case, so that was the first thing. The second thing was load it as a packed disk primitive. So copy this, come over to our smoke area, and put it there. Oh, try again. There it is. Awesome. And what else do we need? I'm going to put the building on for a minute and say we also need to have a ground plane. Or at least, we do. I want to in this lesson for the rendering. Geometry, render, ground. Like so. This is just going to be a regular old ground, or a regular old grid. The grid, I'll use a transform right after it to say it's big. It could be real big. How about we make it like, I don't know. I want to rotate it too. I want it to be like aligned kind of at the camera a little bit. Let's say it's 10 just to make it overkill. And then in the back here, I'm just gonna select these points, pull them up, like so. Say that this is on the grid itself. Say it's a NURB surface, so we get a nice little smooth thing, like so. And I'll just continue pulling this up. So now we have a good enough ground plane. Sweet. So what else we need to do? With those set up, we want to say, and this is an motion blur, by the way, just a ground plane. Let's actually set up the rendering stuff we're used to. I'm going to go over to the out area, put a mantra node down. I certainly need at least to be the frame range. Camera is already there. Let's have override camera resolution at first, at least, so we can do quicker renders, so it's going to be half the size. Where should we put stuff? Well, let's put it in job/render/version, and now we can go use our render version here. So copy that and paste absolute references there. Now let's call it render dot file or dot frame dot exr. Cool. So we're flying now. I don't know if there's not much else. Physically based rendering is always nice. Allow motion blur so we actually see it turn on is nice. That's probably enough for now. I don't want to render everything at first. I'm going to say let's not just render anything that happens to be on. Let's only force on, for now, just the building and the ground. We'll turn everything else on one by one as we work through it. But at the very least, let's establish the ground rules here. So if I go to render view, I can render what we have so far. And as you might expect, we're just going to have that one distant light that we made before with some otherwise pretty boring looking ground and building on it. So thinking ahead, what are we going to need? Well, we need to set up our base materials. So there you go. That's what we have so far. And for sake of argument, I'll take a snapshot of it. I'm also going to turn off the auto re-render thing. So one thing we notice, actually before we even do the materials here, is the building itself doesn't have its materials on it. If we look back at the scene view, it should have these dark areas and these light areas, and if you remember from Widgets 2, the internal ones. And in fact, we can see the materials here already, all the concrete, dark, light, and interior stuff. As you also might recall from Widgets 2 if you saw it, we need to force those materials to work. So don't worry about this too much. This is talked about more in the other lesson. But we do need to go to this render tab under the rendering tab here and say save all materials. And now if I click render again, that will work. So what else we need? We need some more principled shaders. So principled shader here. That'll be for the, let's say this is for the ground plane. And there you can see while we were waiting, we now have the materials on, so that's cool. The ground plane will get some color, but we definitely don't want it to be reflective, so take a moment to turn that off. We also are going to have a principled shader for our particles. Same story, no reflectivity, so just make sure it's still set. And we're going to need a pyro shader, although we're going to talk about that in a different chapter, for our actual smoke, but there it is in any case. So we can go look at the particles and ground plane objects here. So we could say particles will get that material. Boom, for particles. Ground plane can get, oh wait, not you. The ones that are actually rendered are these. So the particles can get the particles one. The ground plane can get the ground plane one. And remember, we don't need one for the building because the actual pieces themselves already have the material definition stored inside of those packed pieces, which is why we had to do that weird thing a moment ago. So let's click render again. And this time I'm gonna have the auto re-render recycle sign back on. That way we can make some quick changes that show up, at least for the ground itself. The general change I need to make to the ground is simply, now what color is it gonna be? I decided green. So let's go to green. And then maybe come down to make it a darker green, a forest green. Okay, that's something. I'm gonna pause this again. Let's also change up our lighting a little bit, because right now it's very flat, like video gamey lighting. We don't really actually want this distant light to do anything. So let's make its replacement, an environment light. Environment light, we're very used to by now, no doubt. Go over to our mantra node, go to our objects, and now let's go down to the lights area. We don't want to just render any light. We want to only render that one environment light. So I'll unpause it so we can get that effect. The environment light, as you've seen in a bunch of lessons probably by now, have light coming from all angles. So we get this kind of more smooth look. So that's something. Limit it to the positive Y hemisphere because there's nothing being rendered below. You can concentrate our samples up there. Let's also go to environment map. Let's give it one of these things. So I'm going to give it Lanong in this case. This is just an image, a high dynamic range image that we can use. It's quite dim. So you can use light exposure or light intensity. I'm kind of using light exposure or intensity the way you'd use exposure, which is powers of 2, I think. But something like that. Just keep doubling it really until it looks. This seems like it's probably good, but I'll go one more anyway. Alright, it's obviously way too high, so we'll go back to 8. Sweet. So this is our kind of baseline of what we want. I'll save that too. You can see, save it in general, and let's do the particles now.